This is the Energy Makers Show, featuring the innovators, financiers, and policymakers focused on the global energy demand. Brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And here's your host, Paul Dickerson.
Hi, I'm Paul Dickerson, and welcome to another episode of the Energy Makers Show. Today we hear from two industry experts. Again, John Hofmeister, founder of Citizens for Affordable Energy, sharing his perspective on clean energy. Next up, Laura Capper, founder of Cap Resources, discussing the other side of the spectrum in unconventional oil. All that right after this.
Where will the energy come from to move us forward? From natural sources in abundant supply, or perhaps a man-made source? At NRG, we believe innovation will solve our energy needs. That's why NRG is moving away from fossil fuels towards wind, solar, and other sustainable technologies to power the smart grid, the electric car, and our clean energy future. We're using all of our energy to develop more of it.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now, back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Paul Dickerson.
Well, and welcome back to the Energy Makers Show. I'm here once again with John Hofmeister, former president of Shell Oil Company and current founder of Citizens for Affordable Energy. John, great to have you back.
Thank you, Paul.
Now, John, let's talk, if we can, about renewable energy. What's your take on America's renewable energy policy today and the current state of the technology?
Let's start with the current state of the technology, because while people are seeing wind towers being built and seeing solar farms being built, let's be clear, these are very inefficient methods of producing energy because the technology is rather new. I submit that 25, 50 years from now, we're going to be in a lot better position to make a lot more energy from the wind, from the sun, from the tides and the river currents because of technological research and development that's going on today. I'm not against the installations that are taking place today because they're teaching us things.
Sure.
They're very expensive. They can only happen with government subsidy. But let's do it because we'll learn from it. And it's not going to hurt the energy supply. It's not going to help it that much, but it's not going to hurt it. Unless we rely too heavily on the volatility of wind and shut down the grid because the wind stops blowing, that would be a problem. But let's learn. And I think nanotechnology for solar is a very big deal to get new materials that are developed in the future that will make solar panels ever more efficient. We need to get to 35, 40% efficiency for solar panels to be commercially efficient. Today they're single digit for the old solar, silicon solar panels. They're getting into double digits with thin film solar, but we really need to get up around 35, 40%. And that's years away, maybe even decades away. Hope not, but it could well be. Tidal currents and river currents, I think we have that technology. We just don't know quite how to apply it yet. So there's a lot of future opportunity. The good news is 100 years from now, the sun, the wind, and the water that we can capture energy from could make energy every bit less expensive than it is today. And that's something to look forward to.
Well, you're right, and that's the power side, and then you've had the biofuels. But before going too deeply into any certain technology policy-wise, how's America stacking up against other nations? Are there other countries doing it right? And what if you could design America's policy? What might it look like?
There's nobody in the world that's the role model for the future of energy at this stage. You can't compare, for example, the United States of America with the state of Israel. The state of Israel is like the state of New Jersey, and it just is not comparable to what the U.S. needs. There are 300 plus million people here, or you can't compare it to China with 1.2 billion people.
Right.
And so there's nobody that I would point to as the example of a comprehensive, systematic. In the case of China, they're building everything, and it's the filthiest sky in the world. I just got back from several weeks in China, and my respiratory system is still reeling from what I had to breathe over there for the time that I was there. And that happens every time I go. It's just filthy in the sky. And while they are putting in windmills, they are working on solar, They're also commissioning a new coal plant every week to 10 days at the same time. Now, in terms of an energy plan for the future, if we really wanted to have the perfect, cohesive, comprehensive plan, it requires 4 things. In my judgment, it requires, number 1, more energy from all sources. You can't exclude any source because of ideological reasons.
Right.
There's all kinds of energy production that's possible, and the world needs more energy. Number 2, you need to use energy more efficiently and produce it more efficiently. So you need technology to be more efficient, and that should be part and parcel of the plan. Superconductivity transmission, for example, distributed smart grid technology.
Yeah.
Move on from the internal combustion engine. It's 100 years old. Why would we continue to rely on a 100-year-old device? It's the only 100-year-old device that we're still relying on. Everything else has changed. We could do batteries, we can do hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, but in the meantime, we could also do other liquid fuels like butanol or methanol, in addition to biofuel, in addition to crude oil. The third thing is we need more infrastructure. And infrastructure has to be maintained and updated. That's the third part of an energy strategy. And the fourth part is we have to have land, water, and air protections so that we leave the earth cleaner for future generations, not dirtier. What we inherited in our generation is a dirty, filthy biosphere. We owe it to our children and grandchildren because we have the technology. We owe it to them to clean it up. And I see nothing wrong with having cleaner land, cleaner water, cleaner air as a legacy of this generation passing on to the next. Those 4 elements, supply, demand, through technology, and infrastructure and environmental cleanliness.
Well, John, you've heard me talk about how important it is for, I think, incumbent energy companies to help some of these new renewable energy companies, learn from some of the lessons from the past and not reinvent the wheel. You're covering a lot of it now. How do we encourage more of the incumbent energy companies to get involved in this process, to help us educate our government, to help some of these new solar biofuels companies really achieve some success?
Well, there's, first of all, the communications/education part. Incumbent energy companies have every opportunity and every good reason to explain to government officials and to the public what they do, how they do it, what, where, and why, and how, and so on. And there's no reason they shouldn't explain, because we all need a better energy education. Everybody does, if we're going to have smart energy for the future. Second, there is something from incumbent energy producers that needs to be shared, which is scalability. It's so important to understand scalability. When you create a new biofuel in a laboratory, that's great. But how are you going to scale it? Not for thousands of gallons, but for millions of barrels. That's what it takes to keep this U.S. economy going. Not tens of thousands of gallons, but millions of barrels per day.
My father used to always tell me that he was a patent attorney, that getting the patent's the easy part, scaling, commercializing is the tough part.
And so we may find that some biofuels are not going to be scalable.
Right.
Well, let's walk away from it sooner rather than later. If you can't scale something to large enough volumes to make a difference in this economy, it shouldn't be subsidized. So we still have more to learn. I'm not giving up on biofuels, but there are some that it doesn't look like they're going to make it. And so let's quit pouring money into it. And so I think that in addition to scalability, it is the ubiquity. How do we get it everywhere?
Right.
And the homogeneity, which is it all has to work in the same kind of vehicles all over the country. So we can't have energy haves and energy have-nots in a democratic society. We all have to have access to affordable energy. So it has to be of size and scale that it makes a difference. That's where the incumbent companies can really teach the startups what it takes.
Well, and most of my energy investor friends will tell me, Paul, we don't really care what the energy policy is or the tax policy as long as it lasts a long time and is certain, right? Give us any 10-year policy and we'll be able to work around it. As you're looking to educate Congress, educate the executive branch, How does the election cycle that I've heard you speak of before, the 2 or 4 year election cycle, how does that play in, and do we have any hope of some long-term durable energy policy?
Well, as somebody who's watched the American political scene closely for most of my career, I'm a political science graduate. We've had 8 presidents promise energy independence. We've had 19 Congresses promise energy independence. None have delivered, and none will. Congress and the White House cannot run the energy system of the country, although they're chartered to do it. I think the American people have to demand a change in the governance of energy. If energy companies need 10-year time horizons, and I know they do, or longer, you can't have 2-year political cycles determining the future of energy, but that's all the Congress can do, 2-year cycles, presidents 4-year cycles, because that's the only time they know they're going to be in office. What we need is a change in the governance where, as in the case of the monetary system, Congress and the White House don't run the monetary system in this country, thank goodness. Instead, the Federal Reserve does. That's an independent regulatory commission. It's been around for 100 years. We're the world's largest economy because we have the Fed. I think we could have the next 100 years of the golden age of energy if we had an energy independent regulatory commission running the future of energy, not Congress, not the White House. That's the main point in my book, Why We Hate the Oil Companies, straight talk from an energy insider. We've got to change the governance of energy if we're ever going to have a future of energy where it's affordable, available, and sustainable.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming in. An education as always. This is the Energy Makers Show, and we'll be right back.
The future is here.
You can't see it. It's electric.
At NRG, we're providing clean energy and now charging stations to make the electric car a reality. Kinda makes you want a boogie woogie, doesn't it? NRG, moving clean energy forward.
It's electric.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now, back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Paul Dickerson.
Welcome back to the Energy Makers Show. My guest now is Laura Capper, CEO and founder of CAP Resources. Welcome back to the show.
Paul, great to see you.
All right, for those of our viewers who didn't see your last episode on Energy Makers, tell us a little bit about CAP Resources.
Sure. CAP Resources is a boutique consulting firm. We're based out of Houston, been around for about 15 years, and we specialize in working with new technologies. We do a lot of work for the energy sector and alternative energies, help identify new markets, make sure the technologies are suited for those markets, and then help our customers try to get customers to uptake those products and services quickly. So kind of fun work.
Yeah.
We get to look at a lot of cutting edge stuff.
Well, I was excited to have you back. You did such a great job educating the audience on water-related issues in the energy business last time. One word that we continue to hear a lot about is unconventional. Unconventional oil, unconventional gas. And I thought it's time that we asked the master back so that you can better explain what is when people are saying unconventional oil or gas, what do they mean?
Well, it's kind of funny because we all take that phrase for granted, and there's really not a super strict definition to it. At kind of a layman's level, I would say unconventional resources are just more difficult and more expensive to get out,
Right.
is what it really boils down to. So in the good old days, somebody drilled a well and the oil flowed freely and yeehaw in West Texas. And now, as we know, it's much more difficult to get those assets out. So you've got to have a higher oil price, higher gas price that can afford that. So the resources are just kind of more locked into the ground is one big difference. It's much more difficult to get out. The other difference with unconventionals, I think, is quite interesting. If I were giving an analogy, I'd say, let's look at conventional as, say, you had a little pot of gold buried underground.
Right.
And if you drill right and you hit that pot of gold, you could have a very successful well. If you drilled 100 feet off base, you could have a dry hole. So there's a lot of exploration risk. Conversely, unconventional is really just the opposite. Huge resources, they're spread out everywhere. But as maybe opposed to a pot of gold, you might have a layer of pennies that's really kind of locked into these sands or shales. So there's a bunch of them. You know they're there. You don't have drilling risk, but you have to get into a very efficient economic process to get them out, because it's just not quite as high a quality resource. You got to work harder at getting it out. So unconventional things include shale gas, the shale being what kind of locks it in, shale oil, certainly heavy oil and tight gas. You might have heard of coal bed methane plays. That's also considered unconventional.
Well, and maybe as we're going through this, let's go through the list and maybe explain what they are and where they're found.
Sure. So we're seeing this rush with shale gas today in North America, and it is really spread pretty widely throughout the country. We started in the Barnett. George Mitchell developed that for a good 10 years or so, and then find that it's really everywhere. Marcellus up in Pennsylvania even dwarfs the Barnett. Ton of stuff going on in Louisiana and East Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and then we're finding also a lot of resources in the Eagle Ford. And almost every time you turn around, there's a new play. Everybody's excited about a new gas play. And the truth is, it takes a while for them to pan out to see if they're really economic. So you're not going to know with the first 1, 2, or 3 wells. It's when you get into full production that you can assess that. So that's the biggie. What's been exciting is in a lot of those gas plays, they're also starting to find oil. Makes it much more economic, obviously. And then coal bed methane is kind of a resource whose popularity kind of comes and goes. It also was very high visibility some years ago, but when the gas price craters, people are less likely to go after unconventionals. And they've kind of resumed that activity more recently with a lot of CBM development. And then a fascinating area, a very different end of the spectrum, is very heavy oil. So you might have heard of heavy oil, primarily up in Canada or in Western California, and those also present unique challenges to bring out of the ground.
All right. Well, and tell me a little bit more, because I'm not sure our viewers know much about the heavy oil.
Sure, and that's been an area we've been looking at for some years, because we are working with some particularly new technologies that are exciting. So heavy oil, if you think about it, it could be on one end something that looks like molasses. It's very thick and viscous. You know, you could dump your jar in half and it could take minutes to slowly drip out. And then the other extreme is bitumen, that really looks kind of like clay. I mean, it's a solid, so how are you going to get that stuff out? So on the heavy oil side, up until kind of some recent developments that are still underway, still not commercial, you really didn't have many options on how to get that out. If it was very shallow, as in kind of Alberta, they're mining it. And you can imagine, none of us are real whooped up about mining these days, just because there's so much remediation that has to take place afterwards, trucks, the whole 9 yards. And you can only get the bitumen maybe 1,000 feet. They don't typically go much deeper than that, because it is a mining process. Probably about 15 years ago, they started kind of playing around with a different method, and that was to set up these very large steam plants on the surface. Then you drill a well or wells and pipe down this very hot steam. And the heat from the steam literally kind of melts and softens the oil and helps it to flow. So you might have heard of SAGD, is a phrase that they use a lot in Alberta. And the benefits of that is that you can actually get to deeper oil. So that's been quite widely adopted. you're using a lot of water.
Sure,
Again, this
sure.
precious resource water thing keeps
Right.
coming up. And you can't go real deep with the SAGD wells, which
Got it.
stands for steam-assisted gravity drainage. Generally speaking, they're only economic to about 2,500 feet. But what's interesting, if you look at the world resources for heavy oil, so I'll see if I can plant this graph in our viewers' brains. We have produced about 1 trillion barrels of oil in the world thus far.
Got it.
Scientists think we can produce maybe another 1 trillion barrels of oil. And if you look at how much heavy oil is out there, there's 9 trillion barrels. So if we could get to that
Sure.
economically and in an environmentally friendly way, it would be a massive resource. So that's a particular area that I think is pretty exciting.
So they're actually pumping hot steam into the well.
They are, and it's been fairly successful, except it's limited when you get down to 2,500 feet. That steam has lost all its heat, it's condensed to water, so you don't have the same quality. You've burned up a lot of energy and you're not delivering that heat to the well. In fact, we're working with a company based out of Fort Worth that's developing a really novel approach so that they can get steam to even deeper resources. And an interesting little tidbit about heavy oil is 96% of the oil out there that's heavy oil is actually below 2,500 feet. So a lot of people have been trying to develop a means to get there. This company, WES, World Energy Systems, has come up with a jet engine technology. So imagine where we're at
Interesting,
today
right?
with technologies. I think it's fascinating. So they essentially have as opposed to having a big steam plant on the surface, they take kind of a micro steam plant in the form of something similar to a jet engine, put that down in the well, can be 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet, and it actually creates the steam at the reservoir face. So you don't have any heat losses coming in there. So it's a pretty interesting technology, holds a lot of promise. A lot of folks are trying to break through that kind of depth limitation, so we'll see who comes out here.
It's an energy efficiency play in heavy oil. Pretty impressive.
It is, and the story's exactly what we all want to hear. It uses less water, less fuel, less CO2 emissions.
Sure.
So if you can get to more resource and have it be environmentally more friendly, that's kind of a double whammy.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it's fun stuff.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. A great education as always.
A pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
And that wraps this week's episode of The Energy Makers, heard on the radio nationwide and seen right here at TheEnergyMakers.com. I'm Paul Dickerson, and we'll see you next week.